Every great story has a great villain. The Lord of the Rings has Sauron, and Star Wars has Darth Vader, and Warhammer has, of course, Horus Lupercal. In this video, we're going to be showing you how to paint this magnificent miniature from start to finish, using techniques that are easy to replicate and will get you a fantastic result and one to absolutely be proud of. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you at the desk. Before we can start painting Horus, we just need to take a look at some of the various assemblies I've built with the miniature, because these are quite important for the way we're going to be painting the model. Essentially what I've got is Horus himself as a full assembly, and then I've got the scenic base. Now Horus is going to fit into that scenic base later on, and the scenic base itself is in a few components, but this way you can see we've got two distinct parts which are going to be painted very differently. Now I'm going to take a closer look at each of these as well, starting out with Horus, and if we take a good look here, you can see what I've done is glued him to a spare base, and this is a 40mm round base just here. I've just super glued him very lightly underneath those tabs that fit into the scenic base just there, and the idea is this allows me to handle him whilst painting him. At the very end it's going to be nice and easy to remove him from the base so we can glue him to the main assembly. Now also with a large resin figure like this, there's probably going to be some air bubbles, so you can see I've done a little bit of green stuffing to hide those, and you can see there was some on the shoulder plate just there. Also I've done a little bit of green stuffing on the fur pelt just up here to blend it together where there's a little bit of a gap, and you can't really see it, but at the pommel of the mace just away hidden there's an air bubble too, so I was sure to get that whilst putting the model together. But there we go, that's the main assembly for Horus, and for the scenic base things get a little bit more complicated, because if you've not seen any of these Primarch miniatures up close before, they're actually designed to have a scenic base where you can display them in a cabinet or something like that, but it disassembles for gameplay to a smaller base that's a bit more useful for the tabletop really. So what we've got is a base prepared for that, and you can see it here. It's actually really large, like a large broken marble statue, and it actually does come apart because the base is hidden in the middle just here. This piece comes off the back, so there it is, and that reveals some of the base hidden just in there, you see, and this then removes from there. And there it is. So this is the actual gameplay base that he fits into, and you can see the base just hidden away down there. Now there is a bit of super glue fogged up on here, and there's a reason for that, and that's because I've put some magnets onto it to make it more secure. So these three I just super glued underneath here, and then what I did on the main part of it, I got 3 balls of green stuff and I pressed 3 magnets into it, and I made sure that it was still pliable and not fully glued, so that I could play around with it to make sure they all matched up so that this would lock into place so that it's nice and secure and that nothing's going to break. Now the magnets on the inside, these 3 on either side, these are all 5mm by 1mm in size, so nice and strong for what we're doing here. And also if you look at the back, the little piece that hides this part of the base here, there's also some more magnets here. Now these are 2mm by 1mm, and what I did for both of these was just cut a little gap inside all that little scenic rubble down there. Put some green stuff, pressed them in, and then on this piece I did the same thing. Some magnets on the back there with some green stuff, made sure they all lined up so that this would lock into place as well, and so that's nice and secure and it's not going to fall apart. Now all this is going to be painted together later on, and we'll come to that later, but first of all what we need to do is undercoat everything, then we're going to start painting Horus. So because these two parts are separate, I can undercoat them in appropriate colours. Horus is going to be undercoated with Chaos Black spray, and then the base is going to be undercoated with some Xandri Dust spray. So I'm going to go and do that now. When we come back, we'll start painting Horus. Got all the components undercoated, and we're going to be starting out by painting Horus, and what we need to do is take a quick look at him, because you can see, as I mentioned, I undercoated him with some Chaos Black spray, and at this stage, because he's so intricate, just take a few minutes just looking around in all the nooks and crannies, like the back of the cloak around there and things, just to make sure you've caught that. If you haven't, what you need to do is just use a flat black of some kind, so something like matte black from the army paint or Abaddon black, anything like that, just to make sure you get those parts fully black before you start painting some colour on there. And for a model like Horus, and indeed any of the Primarchs, they're very intimidating at first glance because they have so much going off and so much intricate detail on their armour. So where to begin? The best thing to do is to look for the biggest part of them, which in the case of Horus is going to be his armour, which is the serpent scales. Now this is mostly black with a sort of brass gold trim, and there are some parts of green on there, but what we're going to do is do all of this together, so all the components at the same time. And it's best to start out with trim like this, where it's so intricate, by base coating that trim, because we can do it quite roughly, then neaten it with the black on the inside, and having that Chaos Black undercoat is going to make doing that really easy. So what we need is a nice brass colour, colour, and for this I'm going to use some Balthazar Gold, and to apply it what I've got is a regiment brush from the Army Painter. And it's important to understand for this first step that we don't need to worry about being neat, and to a degree you definitely want to keep it just to that trim, but if you do go over it doesn't really matter because we are going to neaten up later on, so don't worry too much about that. You're just going to make sure it's nicely thinned down, so I want to bring it down to about this consistency here. You see I'm just testing to make sure it's just a little bit inky, not really runny, but it's also not as thick as it is straight out the pot. And I'm also making sure my brush hasn't got loads of paint on there because it's very easy to overdo this, because as we move in, you can see especially with the breastplate, the detail is so intricate and in some cases really fine, it's very easy to accidentally gum too much paint on there and clog it all up. So going into this, what you need to do is just focus it towards that trim area, but as you can see I'm not being too neat, it's catching some of the flat panels, but I'm just making sure the paint's kept thin so it doesn't clog that detail. Now, doing it this way does mean you are going to have to apply the paint as multiple thin coats, but don't worry about that. Just take your time, just really, make sure it's not too thick and it's not clogging anything up, and just work around the miniature looking for any brass, and this includes on the weapons as well. And there we go, I've picked out all that bronze trim and you can see I've got it on the weapons too, and with that done we can now move on to the next step, which is going to be to apply a wash over the top of this bronze. And the reason why we're doing this now is because that detail's so intricate, in some places it's quite hard to tell where it actually ends, so by applying a wash over the top of it, what it's going to do is fine line it and clearly define it too, so in the next step when we start neatening up that black we can see clearly what we need to do and where we need to go with it. So for this what we need now is a dark brown wash, and the one I'm going to use is some Agrax Earthshade, and to apply it I'm going to stick to the same brush, so still that regiment brush. And with this all you need to do is use a palette. I do recommend it here just to make sure there's not too much on there, because again we don't want to gum up any of this detail, but it means we can get the right amount on the brush there by just removing excess off on the tile, and then it's just a matter of painting it directly over the bronze. So for example on the chest just here you can see it's quite tricky to tell what's going off there, but if we apply the wash over the top of it, all of a sudden those wolf heads and details all stand out nicely, and this way it'll be easier in that next step. So now it's just a matter of applying this quantity over all this bronze and giving it about 20 minutes to dry. And there we go, the wash is completely dry, and you can see whilst it's darkened that colour down, it has clearly defined it, so perfect for what we need to do now, which is going to be to neaten up that black plate. And here what you need is a pitch black, and this can be any sort of black you want. In this case what I'm going for is Doom Death Black, which is one of the two thin coats paints, but if you want to stick to Citadel then Abaddon Black is the colour to use here, and if you want to go from the Army Painter then what you want to use is some matte black. The choice really is yours. Whatever you go for though, what you need to do is set this up, and if you haven't got one already, I do recommend using a wet palette for this stage, because this stage will take a little bit of time. It's going to be neat with it. Having a wet palette really helps keep the paint pliable for a long time. So I just need to get a little bit of this on the palette. So there we go. And then go for a brush with a really fine tip on it. So the best one you can get hold of. In this case, what I've got is one from Artist Opus. I've got a size 0 for this, but if you want to stick to Citadel, then a small layer is what I'd recommend here. Something smaller like that with a good point, because we need that control. Definitely make sure you thin that paint down on your palette. So add that little bit of wash to it as you need to bring it down to that inky consistency. And once you've got that ready, just twist away the excess paint so that you get those bristles to a nice point, because what we're looking to do is to carefully apply this onto these panels in between that trim. So for example, on the breastplate just here, you can see now the wolf standing out, the lightning bolt and things. What we want to do is carefully apply it into that recessed area like this, just going up to that trim but not onto it, so that it neatens it up so we get that smooth black on the armour. Once you've finished neatening up all that black, the next thing that we're going to do is apply a subtle highlight onto the black, because there's quite a lot of it, and of course this is pretty much as big as characters go in Warhammer 40k and 30k. So what we're going to do is add an extra subtle highlight to that black to start to build up towards the highlights, which we'll add later on. And for this what I'm going to use is some Corvus Black, and to apply it I'm sticking to that size 0 brush. And with this what I'm looking to do is to thinly apply it on parts where it's going to be catching the light. So it's still going to look black overall, it's just going to give that black more depth, and it's going to, well, really give a bit of shadow to it as well, because that darker black is going to be showing through underneath and around the sides as well. So for this what we want to do is thin it down so it's a little bit inky, about to have that sort of consistency there. And what we're looking for is areas where light would be catching on the armour. So a really clear example would be on top of this leg just here. What we want to do is apply this colour thinly onto this sort of area here, so towards the top of it where that light source is going to be coming down from the top. And you can see I'm almost flicking it on there, but I'm not going into the corner where it meets that trim, so it stays darker in the recess. And I'm also not going to be going underneath either, so it goes darker as we go round the leg. Same on the other side, we're looking at this sort of area here. I just want to thinly apply it to the top there, so again almost flicking it on. along there like that. And the same is true on all of the black armor plates. Now, there are some parts to avoid, and that's on these little lunar wolf icons that appear in his armor. The background circle of it needs to stay pitch black because that's the night sky of that particular symbol, so be sure to avoid that. But on the other hand, if you encounter any cables or any joints in the armor, and they're a bit hidden away, but there are some hidden underneath the back just there, be sure to block them entirely in with this color at this stage. And with that, we've now got that first subtle highlight on the black, and we'll come back to that black later on. But before we do so, what we need to do is just neaten up the trim first of all, and then there are a few other colours that we need to add on as base coats. So for this, we're going to return to Balthasar Gold first of all for that trim, but then after that, we're going to add in some Lupercal Green, followed by some Gorthor Brown. Now, first of all, we need Balthasar Gold, and to apply it, I'm sticking to that size 0 brush. And here, we don't have to do all the trim. We're just looking for the parts that are larger and flatter. We just want to bring that shine back to some of those areas. So there's not actually loads to do for this part, but it is important to make sure that paint is under control because it is intricate, unfortunately. So just make sure it's nicely thinned down and just remove that excess off your brush because you're really not going to need very much here. What you do need is that fine tip on the bristles. So once you've got that control there, what we're then looking for is these parts such as this one here on the chest. You can see how there's this wider trim going around this part here. All we're looking to do is to carefully apply it onto these flatter parts such as around here and around this eye design. And as I say, it's just to bring that shine back to these little parts here. So really we're just looking at these sort of more open areas, including on the shoulder just here and in the eye of Horus symbols, so around here like this. When it comes to the narrower trim, such as along here, you don't need to worry about that because it's so narrow the highlight's going to do the job for us. So just look for these more open places and just gently lay out on each one just to bring that shine back to them. With that done now, you can see we've got that nice shine return to those larger parts of the bronze, and so now we're going to move on to Lupercal Green, and this is for this shoulder plate at the top just here. Now blocking this in is a little bit intricate because we've got to avoid all of that trim, but it's just a matter of taking your time and being aware that this is quite a thin colour, so it will need a few coats to build it up. I'm sticking to that size 0 brush to keep that control, but it's just a matter of being patient. Once that green's been built up, we're then ready to move on to Gorthor Brown, and this is for the leather straps, and they appear here on the groin, and also they're on the arms too. And for this, I've switched up to a size 1 brush because it's quite easy to access this area, so good for base coating here. But if you want to stick to Citadel, then go for a medium layer brush for this. Once you finish base coating that leather too, the next thing to do is apply another wash to the miniature, and this time it's going to be a black wash for that dark green that we've added and also the brown detail, just to give it that definition and that depth. And so I'm using Norn Oil for this, and to apply it, what we've got to do is change brush sizes depending on which part you're doing, because that green, as you know by now, is quite intricate. So here, I'm sticking to the size 0 brush for that control, but for the leather straps, feel free to go for whatever size you like, just as long as it keeps it only on that leather. But for the green, what I'm going to do is use the palette just to make sure I don't have loads on the brush here, and even some tissue to remove excess. Because what we need to do is just introduce it into that recessed area in amongst all that bronze trim. So for example here, what I want to do is just approach almost straight on with the brush and just gently introduce it into the middle and just let it flow outwards so it meets that trim and gets that shading and definition around the outside edges of the green. Once that wash is completely dry, we've now got laid in the majority of the colours that appear on the armour, so what we're going to do now is start the highlighting process here. I'm going to start out with that trim. For this, what I've got is some Liberator Gold, and what we're going to be doing is edge highlighting with it on all of that trim, which is actually not as difficult as it might first appear because a lot of it's sort of raised up and stands out quite clearly, so it's quite easy to get to. But for it, you definitely want to go for a brush with a really good point on it. So here, I've actually gone right down to a size 00 from Artist Opus. So nice small brush here, lots of control on it, ideal for what we're doing. If you want to stick to Citadel, then you're looking at something like a small layer brush, really. Just a nice small brush with a good point. And here the trick to it is to make sure it's nicely thinned down so that it flows easily from the brush, but not so fast that it runs out of control, because you don't want to swamp that detail with this. So it's a matter of bringing it down to this point where you can see it's almost inky in how thin it is. And it's quite translucent on the palette there too, but also it's flowing easily from the brush. And you see I'm just playing around with it on the palette and seeing how it flows from the bristles, and it's nice and smooth there, so I'm happy with that. Now the next thing is just to make sure you don't have loads in your brush, so I'm just going to use a tissue to remove excess paint, draw up a small amount, and if you look closely at the bristles now, it doesn't look like there's much paint on there. When I run it on the palette, you can see it does leave the trail behind. So that's the sort of load that we're looking for with this, because this way it won't go out of control. And so what we're looking for is all of that brass trim that we picked out and the brass details on the weapons. And what we need to do is highlight all the parts that stand out. So you can see the edge that stands out quite distinctly on here. This is why it's relatively simple to do this for the majority of it, because all you got to do is angle your brush fairly flat against it and just skim along with the side of the bristles like that. So the colour only catches that raised area. And this way it's very quick and very easy to get a nice highlight running across that edge. And the same is true for, well, most of it really. You just got to make sure you angle the model so that you're comfortable, and so you can approach using the side of your brush and then just take your time, just gently skimming across those details, just as neatly as possible. Now you won't always be able to do this, and that's when you have to use the tip of the brush, and that's when this highlighting process is a bit more tricky. But to do it, what I do is really brace my hand so nice and steady, so make sure you've got that point on your brush and then paint in a downward motion towards yourself. So for areas like here where it's not standing out quite so much, this way you can go downwards and follow that edge and get the highlight on the corner to help it pop without it running out of control or being too wide or anything like that. So now it's just a matter of taking your time, and this will be one of the longer stages of painting Horus simply because there is so much trim to do here. But it is also one of the points that if you get it really neat, is going to look fantastic when you're done. So just really take your time and be as neat as possible. And there we go. It took a little bit of time, but you can see now we've got a nice highlight applied onto all of that trim, and so it's popping out nicely. And so now what we're going to do is move on to highlighting the black. And to do this, we're first of all going to return to Corvus Black, but this time bring in some Mechanica Standard Grey to it to make it a little bit lighter. And this is going to be the first highlight, which is going to be soft. So we're looking for where the light's going to be cast on top of the armour. And after this, we'll then move on to some edge highlighting finished off. But first of all, what we're going to do is get that mix ready, and so you can see I've already got some Corvus Black still ready from previous stages, but now I'm just going to bring some Mechanica Standard Grey into it, and for this I'm still using that size 00 brush here because we only want a small amount of it, and we're looking to create that slightly lighter shade of black really well, a dark grey, and this sort of tone is what we're going for. Now we need to make sure it's nice and thin because we're going to be thinly applying it onto this surface just gradually to build it up, so what we want to do is bring it right down to that sort of consistency, nice and translucent, you see. And then just make sure you've only got a small amount on your brush, and then it's just a matter of identifying these areas where the light will catch the armour plate. So for example, on the leg once again around this top area just here, what we're looking at doing is just applying it into this area just around here so it gets a little bit lighter towards the top of it. So it's almost a crescent shape that I'm applying on there. Same on the other side where again we just want to dot it on very gently like that, just to steadily build it up so we get that lighter tone towards the top of the armour. Once you're finished with that soft highlight, we're then ready to move on to those edge highlights. And here we're going to be applying two. First of all, just Mechanica Standard Grey on its own, but then after that, what we need is a light grey. So for this, I'm going to use some Administratum Grey. But we're going to be starting out with Mechanica Standard Grey, and for this, I'm sticking to that size 00 brush, and here it's just going to be an edge highlight. So just like what we did with the gold, the good thing about the black is there really isn't that much to do at this stage, but there are still a few edges that we do need to pick out just to give them that sharp finishing touch. So make sure your paint's thinned down for the purpose, so make sure it's nice and smooth, and also remember, just make sure it's flowing well from the brush, but also that there's not loads on there. Because what we want to do is, again, wherever possible, go in with the side of the brush. So around the top of the armour, for example, so want to approach using the side and just gently skim across that corner to get a nice highlight going across that edge. So it looks nice and clean just to help finish this detail off. Now, of course, you won't always be able to reach for the side of the brush, so sometimes you will need to have to paint downwards towards yourself using the tip, such as around here on the top of this part of the armour, but just very carefully follow it, just taking your time to get that neat highlight. Once that's done, we're then ready for a fine highlight using Administratum Grey, and this is again an edge highlight, but instead of everywhere now on the black details, we're just focusing it towards sharper corners and details that pop out more. So for example, on the top of the armour just here, see I'm just focusing it towards this corner, just very lightly skimming it along so it gets a little bit lighter and it helps it pop a little bit more. When it comes to curved surfaces, we're looking for the areas where the light's going to catch, and in the case of this one across the top of the head, that means just applying it just along the top middle along here. And there we are. With that, the black armour is complete. And so what we're going to do now is move on to highlighting some of those smaller details. I'm going to return to that green first of all. To do this, we first need to layer it with some Lupercal green once again, just to make it a little bit lighter. And so to do this, I'm sticking to that size 00 brush because, as you know, the green area is actually really small. So we need a lot of control here. You won't need loads of the paint, but the idea here is just to layer this towards the middle of this area just to make that green just a little bit stronger. And as I mentioned earlier, it is quite a weak paint, so just bear in mind you will have to build this up with just 1 or 2 layers of it. So you only need a small amount, and then once you've got it ready, what we're looking to do is to carefully start applying it into the middle of these areas. So for example, between the eye just there and that chain, we just want to apply it just into the middle very carefully around that area there, leaving it darker on either side in the corners. Once that's done, the next thing to do is to apply a highlight onto the green parts, and for this what we're going to be using is Sons of Horus Green, and to apply it we're going for a smooth highlight, so it's going to be a lot like when we were highlighting that black. What we want to do is just get some of this, only a small amount, but thin down so we can apply it as a few coats to really build up the colour. So we just need to get a small amount on the palette, and again I'm still using that size 00 brush, and as I mentioned, what we want to do is just add that water to it to make it nice and translucent and a little bit inky. So just bring it down to about this sort of point here, so you can see the palette showing through there, and with that prepared then we just need to start applying it onto the green panel, but towards the top where the light would be catching it. So in the case of this side here, that means just painting it towards the top of this part around there, just on the inside there, and on this side just here. And once that's dry, just a second coat in the same way. On the back of it, again, we're looking to go towards the top, so we're looking at this area just here, right underneath the eye symbol on top of the shoulder pad. Having built up that Sons of Horus colour there, you can see now we've got a nice highlight on that green panel on the shoulder, and so now what we need to do is to highlight those leather straps that we did earlier on, and for this the colour to use is some Baneblade Brown, and to apply it again stick to your small brush, so I'm still using the size 00 here, and what we're looking to do is to apply it as an edge highlight, a bit like with the Armour, but slightly rougher, and also adding just a few little lines in there just to give the impression of texture, because we want this to look like old cracked leather. So to do this, set up as if you were going to be edge highlighting, so just making sure that paint is nicely thinned, and again just making sure you don't have too much of this on your brush. So we're looking for about this sort of consistency. I think that feels about right, and then just remove the excess, and then we're ready to go. And what we want to do is, when we're applying it, rather than just smoothly applying it, we want to be a little bit rough in the application. So as I'm putting it on here, I'm just going to be dotting it ever so slightly. So you can see I'm just letting my hand shake just a little bit as I work my way down. And this way I don't get a consistent line. Instead I do have a line, but it's just a little bit rough and a little bit uneven. You can always go back to it to emphasize it a bit more if you want to. But then as you're going along, every now and then, just introduce a few little lines going out into the flat of the leather. So just very gently like that, just to give the impression of a few cracks in it, just to help build that texture a little bit more. And with that done, the leather is now complete. And so what we're going to do now is move on to the next area of colour, because all that black and gold armour with all the green and things, we've pretty much finished all that now. And so what we now need to do is start painting all the silver detail that appears around it and under it. And for all of this, what we're going to do is start out with a base coat of iron hand steel and then wash over it with some Null Oil for some definition. And with a black wash like this, it'll look nice and clean. After that, some select parts will need to be layered using iron hand steel once again to make them a bit brighter. Then finally, we need a highlight of Stormhost silver. We're going to start out with iron hand steel for the base coat, and to apply it I've switched to the size 0 brush here, but you will need to change sizes a few times throughout this phase because some of these details are quite large, some are quite small, so just change depending on what you're comfortable with. But throughout the process, as ever, it's a matter of making sure your paint is nicely thinned down, and then you've just got to identify all these details. And they are scattered across the miniature, but generally you're looking at mechanical kind of things. So for example, in the leg armour you can see there's these pistons that are visible just in here. We're looking to get details like this, so it's just a matter of just being as neat as possible, blocking this in around the surrounding area that we've done already, and just really taking your time. Remember to brace your hands so you're nice and steady, so you're not shaking, so you can be neat as you're doing this. In addition, we're looking at things like cables. There's some mechanical parts on the bolter on the back of the wrist just here, also the claws too, but a thing that we definitely need to get at this stage is all these cables that appear around his head. Now these can be a little bit tricky to get to, so just make sure you angle the brush this sort of way here, just so you can carefully move in and just get the metal details that are visible. And don't worry too much about getting everything, just so long as the parts that are more visible are painted silver, then that'll be absolutely fine. Once you've picked out all those silver areas, the next thing to do is apply a coat of Null Oil over each one. And for this, again, change brush size as you need to. I'm starting out with a size 0, and you can see I'm just being really careful, just making sure I only get the black wash over the silver. Once that wash is completely dry, we're then ready to return to iron hand steel, and this time we're going to layer it onto the silver details, and really the larger, more open ones, just to make them a little bit shiny. So the talon, for example, on the fingers just here, this is a great place to do it. What we're looking at doing is applying this silver onto the flatter surfaces whilst avoiding the recesses, so just being careful as we get to that rivet at the top, and this way you can see it returns the shine to that detail and makes it look that much sharper. And with that layering done, we can now move on to highlighting all the silver. And for this, what we need is some Stormhost silver. And this is going to be just like with the gold. We're looking to edge highlight all of it. And this means switching down to that smaller brush. So I'm back to using the size 00. And wherever possible, you want to use the side of the brush to skim along these edges. But if you can't quite reach it, remember, just switch to using the point of the brush. And to do this, it's all about just turning the model so you're nice and comfortable, just so you can find those edges and follow along each one. Now, if you want to at this stage as well, what you can do is add an extra fine highlight to the gold to really help finish that off. And if you decide you want to do this, look for the sharpest details that stand out, such as the top of the knee just there. Just gently skim across it just to add a little bit of that silver onto the sharpest point just to help finish that off. And with that, the silver is now finished, and so we can move on to the next thing, which is going to be to paint that wolf pelt that goes over the top of the armour. For this, we're going to start out with a base coat of a dark grey, so I'm going to use some Mechanicus standard grey here, and to apply it, I've got that size 1 brush once again, and with this, all we're looking to do is block it all in, essentially. So what we need to do is just set up for that base coat by, as ever, making sure the paint's nicely thinned down, so it's nice and smooth, and then it's just a matter of taking your time blocking this in. Now, the texture does mean that doing this can be a little bit frustrating because you do need to work it into all the nooks and crannies as you go along, but don't get carried away doing it because it's very easy to lose control of the bristles and get the colour onto parts that you've done so far, especially around this targeting lens just here. So just take your time as you get close to the details like this, but otherwise as you get to more open areas you can be a bit quicker, but it's just a matter of making sure all of this is blocked in at this stage. Once you have that even base coat on the pelt all the way around, including on the back there, the next thing to do is to apply a wash onto it. And here what we need to do is get a nice earthy natural feel to it. So we're going to use a brown wash for this to start out with. So what I'm going to use is some Agrax Earthshade, and to apply it I'm going to begin with that size 1 brush, but feel free to have a larger one on hand for the more open area across the top. But as you get to the edges around that detail, especially the top of the armour, you do need that control. So definitely keep a brush of about this size for that purpose. Also, I recommend you use the palette to draw from just to control exactly how much is on there, because when painting this on, what we need to do is be careful, and what I recommend you do is start by applying a distance away from the edge of it, so around there for example, and then once you've got some of that wash on there, just draw it down to the edge, just bring it down to it. This way you'll have much more control as you get close to that detail. The wash is now completely dry, and you can see it has darkened that pelt down quite a bit, but that's okay because now what we're going to do is move on to our first dry brush to start to lighten things up, and dry brushing is perfect when there's loads of texture here. What we need is a medium grey colour, so I'm going to use some Dawnstone for this, and I am going to be dry brushing it on, but there's kind of 2 phases to this. I'm going to be starting out using a small dry brush here from Citadel, and with this we're looking to do the majority of it. So all you need to do is get a small amount of the paint in the brush, then get some tissue and just start working it into the bristles whilst also removing the excess paint until there's not that much appearing on the paper, so that sort of appearance just there. And then with this, what we're looking to do is a fairly broad dry brush across all of the pelt. So we're looking for the main body just here. I'm going to go back and forth, just building up that colour, really working it in so we get that lighter grey starting to catch on to that texture. Now the reason why I've got a second stage here is actually for a different brush, because as we get towards the front here, it starts to get quite tricky as we're getting close to the detail we've done so far. So for that reason, I've got a second brush, and this one is actually a regiment brush from the Army Painter. Now this is an older one that I keep around for this sort of purpose, because I'm going to be sort of dry brushing with it, but it just gives a bit more control than what the main dry brush does. So we want to set up in a similar way, just a small amount of paint there, and what I'm going to do is just start running it into the brush. So you see the motion I'm doing here. I'm not being super rough with it to keep the bristles together, but I am doing the same sort of thing in that I'm removing excess paint off and just making sure the paint on the brush is pretty dry. And then with this, what I can now do is have more control as we get close to that detail, because you can go in at this sort of angle here, just start gently brushing across it, and this way you won't go over the parts that we've already painted so far. Once that grey's been built up to this point, the next thing that we need to do is apply a darker pattern in the centre of that fur, because in the box artwork what you've got is a bit of a dark patch there, and to get that we're again going to use a wash. This time a black wash, so what I've got is some Norn oil, and to apply it I'm going to be using a medium shade brush from Citadel, so surprisingly large for this kind of thing, but that's because of the sort of area that we need to cover here and the method to do it. So what we need to do is just start out with some of that on the palette, so a good amount loaded up in the brush, and this we're just going to start by applying it in the centre of the pelt, so we're looking at this sort of area around here. The reason why I've gone for this larger brush is just to get a good amount of that paint to really make it run into that texture. So we just want to work it around this sort of area like this. Now the idea to make it fade out into the surrounding area is to bring it up to about this sort of point here towards the bottom of the pelt, just there, and then quickly wash the brush and just make sure you've got a little bit of water in there, not loads and loads, but just enough so that what we can do is just start smearing it over where the paint ends and pulling it downwards, and this way what it will do is fade out into that grey surrounding it. The wash is now completely dry, and you can see it's given us that darker patch in the center of the pelt, which is great because now what we can do is work on that to build up the lighter parts surrounding it. And for this, we're going to do some more dry brushing by first of all returning to Dawnstone, and then after that we'll need some Administratum Grey, followed by some Pallid Witch Flesh. But first of all, we need Dawnstone, and to apply it, you can see once again I've got both brushes, and just change as you need to as you get close to that detail. But I am starting out with a small dry brush here from Citadel. What we need to do is set it up again for a very light dry brush, and then the idea here is to start working around the outside, avoiding that darker patch that we've got in the center. So with this color, for example, we're looking at going down areas like this tail just along here, but only going up to around about this point here. So you can see by lightly applying it and building it up, it stays darker in the middle but gets lighter as we get further to the outside. With that done, we're now ready to build up that colour a little bit lighter. So here I'm using some Administratum Grey, and you can see I'm starting out with that regiment brush right to begin with now because we're going a little bit further out and so closer to that existing detail. So just take your time, just making that grey lighter towards the edges of the pelt. And then finally we need some Pallid Witch Flesh, and this is once again a dry brush, but just very lightly now around the outer edge of the pelt. So looking at areas such as down here, and these edges get really close now to the detail of the armour. And there we are. With that, all that fur on the pelt is now painted, and so we can move on to the next thing, which is going to be to paint his red cloak. And for this, what we need to do is start out with a really strong base coat red. So what we're going to use here is Mephiston red. Now, this isn't really a weak paint or anything, but you do have to go into this expecting to have to apply it as a few thin coats because we are painting it straight over black, so it's going to take a little bit of time to build up. And it is important that it's as smooth as possible because we are going to be doing some blending on it, so we want a nice smooth surface to work upon. So definitely make sure that you got that paint thin down in your palette. And for this, I've actually started out with a monster brush from the Army Painter. So nice large brush because most of this cloak is very easy to get to and it's quite large, so good for base coating it. But you might want to have some smaller ones on hand when you start getting around to the detail underneath the pelt especially, because you'll need much more control around those areas. But throughout this process, it's just a matter of making sure that paint is nice and smooth, and once you've done so, all you've got to do is start blocking it in. So we're looking at all of the cloak around here, just need to apply a few thin coats to make sure it's a nice strong red before you move on to the next stage. And there we are, that red's been built up, and it does take a few coats to get it there, but it is important it's nice and smooth for the next step, which is going to be to start to do some shading on here. And what we're going to do is do some wet blending with it. We need some Mephiston red once again, but now we need a pitch black. So go for the same one that you used earlier on. In this case, I'm using Doom Death Black once again. And what we need to do is just create a variety of tones on the palette. Now for this, I'm using a regiment brush. And you can see I've got my black here and I've also got the red. What I'm looking to do is never actually use pure black, but instead I just want to have a variety of tones of red. So I'm just going to bring some of this into it and just start mixing these two together like this. And so what I'm looking for is this sort of really dark brownish red there like that, but also I want to just bring in a bit more of this red to get a slightly lighter tone going off just there as well. So there we go. You see, this way I've got a variety of colours all prepared, and I'm just going to get a bit more of the pure red as well, just a bit more of that ready. And there we go. And so with this prepared then, what we can do is start to apply it. And the idea here is that what we're going to do is start introducing the darker shade of red into the deeper recesses on the fabric. But whilst it's still wet, then also start applying the lighter red and just mix the two as we go along on the miniature itself. Now it sounds complicated, but it's really not that difficult really. You just have to get into it and just have the confidence to give it a go. And so what we need to do is to help out with this is just make sure that paint's thin just a little bit. And then I'm going to start with that darker shade. So with this, what we're looking to do is to introduce it into those deeper areas. So for example, on here, we're looking at painting it directly into this corner down here. So I just want to paint it in this area there like that. And then whilst it's still wet, I'm just going to quickly grab some of that brighter red and I'm just going to start applying it on the side like this. And you see, by just doing this downward motion like that, the colour mixes directly on the fabric and it starts to blend the two together. Now that darker colour is quite strong, so I'm just going to get a bit more of the brighter red and just bring that on top of it there like that. And you can see, so long as you're quick, you can get that nice gradient going from dark to light. Now if it's ever too stark a transition in one go, then don't worry about it. Just let it dry and do a second coat over the top, because like anything, multiple thin coats will really help build it up. So it's just a matter of taking your time and playing around with it, and this way you start to get that nice shading in the deeper recesses of the fabric. And there we go, that's the shading applied. Now it takes a little bit of time just going back and forth between the colours, just adjusting it as you need to, but you just need to stick at it until you get that smooth gradient happening there on the inside as well. And with that done, we're now going to move into the highlights here. And for this, what we need first of all is some Evil Sunz Scarlet, but again, at the same time, going to be using some Mephiston Red, because once again, we just want to blend them as we apply them. So we need to get that ready first of all. I'm using the size 1 brush here from Artist Opus this time, just for a little bit more control, because now this is going to be just a little bit more focused as we apply this. We don't need quite so much of it as with that previous stage, but it's still a matter of just getting both these ready next to each other on your wet palette once again. So there we go. And then we just want to start bringing them together so we've got that variety of tones. Now these two colours are already quite close to each other, so actually this is quite straightforward doing this stage. But having the variety there that you can draw from means you can adjust quickly on the fly as you're applying it. And again, the way to do this is to start out with the lighter colour in this case. So we're looking at using some Evil Sunz Scarlet. We just need to get some ready. So it's a little bit too thin there. So there we go. And then let's get not too much on your brush, and with this we're now targeting the parts that are more raised up. So for example, on this part of the cloak just here, we want to start applying it onto this kind of area. So away from the dark parts, more in the middle, just at the very crest of the fabric. So all the way down, and then quickly, whilst it's still wet, we're just going to grab some of the mix of the more Mephiston Red tone and just start applying that next to it to help just blend it into that surrounding area. With Evil Sunz Scarlet now applied, you can see now we've got a lovely rich red going off with the cloak, and we're ready to add a highlight onto it. And for this, what we need to do is go a bit brighter. So here we're going to use some Wild Rider Red, and to apply it, what I've got now is a smaller brush. I've gone for a size 01 here. And with this, what we're now looking to do is to accentuate the outer edge of the cloak, so following it all the way around except for the darkest areas. But also what we want to do is to pick out the sharpest creases on the fabric too. So you need to prepare the paint as if we're going to be edge highlighting with it really. Just making sure it's nice and thin, again testing it for that consistency and just making sure it's flowing well from the brush. And then with this to begin with, what we need to do is to look to those parts that are on the outside edge. And here you can actually use the side of your brush. So for example, these curves we've got around here, just make sure you angle it so that you're approaching with that side of the brush, and then just gently skim across these parts where it's strongest and brightest. So going down to about this sort of distance here, then leaving it darker in the recess and carrying on again on the other side to around about there. Now also we want to use this as the final highlight on the actual curves of the fabric too. So here what we're looking for is the creases such as this one just sweeping around here. So I want to very carefully, using the tip of the brush, just follow it down with this sweeping motion all the way down the very top of it, just to give it that final highlight to help finish it off. And with that highlight applied, the red of the cloak is completed, but we still do have to do a bit of a trim because you can see just as a key line around the base, just along there's a little design, so we need to pick that out. And for this, what we're going to go for is a sort of goldish kind of effect, and to do it, we need to start out with a base coat of some Xandri dust. Now to apply it, definitely go for a brush here with a fine point, because you are going to need it for this, because we've got to pick out that pattern, so it requires quite a lot of control. So I'm using a size 0 Artist Opus brush for this one. And to get it ready, again, it's just a matter of making sure it's nicely thinned down so that you've got that control over it. And then with this, what we're looking to do is use the tip of the brush to pick out that pattern. So it's a bit like freehanding, but you have already got it laid out there for you. So it's not as difficult as just doing it purely, on your own. So what we need to do, once that's ready, just test on the palette, just to make sure you're happy with that. And that looks good to me. What we're then ready to do is to start tracing along this pattern. So you can see it around here with that eye symbol and then the banding going down. What we want to do is just very carefully move in and just very gently follow it all the way around. Just turn in the model as you need to be comfortable, and just very carefully take your time picking out that raised pattern. Now when it goes especially dark, like in the deepest area there, don't worry about that for now because we're going to come back to that in the next stage. So instead you just want to go close to it, going to around about that point just there. Now you also need to pick out that eye symbol, and for this, again, it's just a matter of just turning the model and being comfortable as you do it. You can see I'm really bracing myself, so I'm nice and steady, but just take your time picking out that raised pattern. With the trim blocked in, the next thing to do is apply a little bit of shading to it. And for this, what we're now going to do is bring in some Rhinox hide. But I've still got some Xandri dust to use at the same time, because there's kind of two stages to this. First of all, what we need to do is mix a slightly darker colour. So you can see I've already got some Xandri dust just here. What I'm going to do is just get a little bit of Rhinox hide and just start mixing them together so we get a darker tone. So we're looking for something in the region of this sort of colour just here. And with this prepared, what we're then looking to do is to apply it into the recessed parts in the cloaks where it dips in and it's going to be in shadow. So it's going to be tracing along where you've done the darker colours really originally when doing that cloak. So with that prepared then, what we're looking for is going to be areas such as in this little area just here. So you can see it's a little bit hidden away. But what we want to do is, again, follow that raised up area and just apply this into here. So we end up with that unbroken line of this colour going all the way around. But as it dips into that shadow, it just gets a little bit darker. So it stays consistent with the rest of the cloak. Now, in addition, there's another thing we can do at this stage using Rhinox hide on its own, and that is just to get a bit of sharpness and definition between that banding and also the red cloak itself. And for this, we just need Rhinox hide on its own, but just make sure you thin it down more now. So we're making it quite runny, really, quite inky. We want to go for about this sort of point just here. And with this, just make sure you don't have much on your brush, so just remove the excess so you've got that fine point on there. And with this, what we're looking to do is just run it into either side of that raised up line. So for example, in this part here, just want to very carefully just look for that recess between the raised up part and the flat of the cloak and just gently run the colour into here. And this will provide just a bit more definition between these two details. With that, we've now got much more definition on that pattern, and so we can move it on towards highlighting it. And for this, what we need first of all is some Shabti Bone, followed by some Screaming Skull, and then what we're going to do is glaze over this with some really thinned down Ironed and Yellow. And what this is going to do is give it a bit more of a gold sort of luster for it. But first of all, we need a Shabti Bone, and to apply it again, stick to your smaller brush. So I'm still using the size 0 here. And with this, what we're looking to do is to sort of be layering it really, focusing on the parts that are raised up. So remember where the highlights were on your cloak. It's that sort of location that we want to apply this. So as ever, make sure it's nicely thinned down and quite translucent as well. We want to bring it right down to about this sort of point here. And with this prepared then, we're just looking to focus on those areas. So on these parts of the cloak, for example, up here, what we want to do is to look where the highlight was and to trace along that sort of area with this colour. Again, following that raised pattern, just very carefully, very thinly applied into this sort of area along here. Next up, we need some Screaming Skull, and this is going to be a highlight on the parts where it's going to be the brightest. So again, we're looking at these parts of the cloak where it's lighter. We just want to add a fine line of this colour just going across the very top of it. So just very carefully along areas such as here. And then finally, what we need is some Ironed and Yellow, which I've heavily thinned down with water because this is a contrast paint, and what instead we're using it here for is a glaze. We just want a hint of more of a yellow across this detail. So once it is thinned down, all you need to do is just very smoothly apply a thin coat over the top of this detail just to give it that little hint of yellow. And with that, the cloak is now complete, and so we can move on to the next detail, which you can actually spot just around here, because what we need to do now is to paint in the skulls that appear on the back of the miniature there, but also there's some claws and teeth that appear on the wolf pelt, so we can do them at the same time. And for this, what we need to do first of all is base coat all of this with some Zandri dust, and then on that wolf pelt, you can actually see its gums a little bit, so here we need some Screamer Pink. But first of all, what we need is Zandri dust, and to apply it, I'm sticking to that size 0 brush, and for this step, all we've got to do is base coat these details in. So it's just a matter of getting that paint thinned down and ready for the purpose, making sure you don't have too much on the brush so you have that accuracy with it, and then it's just a matter of picking these details out. So we've got these skulls to begin with, just being careful of those gold designs that are on them, so just block them in all the way around like this, but also keep an eye out for the claws which appear down here. You can see there's some just on the very end of that arm of the pelt, and also we've got the teeth around here too, so be sure to get them at this stage as well. With that base coat done, we can now move on to Screamer Pink, and this is for a really small detail, but we do need to do it, as it's just for the little gums that are visible right in here. With that little detail picked out, the next thing to do is to apply a wash over both of these colours. And for this, what we now need is a dark brown wash. So I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade here. And to apply it, I'm going to stick to the size 0 brush because we don't need loads of it, but we do need to keep it just focused on these new areas, especially on the mouth of the wolf just there. You don't want it to run out of control. So just use the palette to control how much is on your brush, and then it's a matter of just painting over these areas. So again, we've got the gums and the teeth on the wolf here, and also there's going to be its claws on the back of the pelt. So just very carefully apply over these parts. But of course, we do have these skulls on the back too, so be sure to get them as well. That wash is completely dry, and so now we can move on to highlighting these details. And here I'm just going to do the bone details because the gums, we don't want them to be too bright and catch too much attention because it is an animal carcass, so they should be faded and we don't want to be too distracting or anything. But for the bone, what we're going to need is some Shabti Bone followed by some Screaming Skull. So we're going to start out with a Shabti Bone, and I'm sticking to that size 0 brush for this. And here what we're looking to do is to really pick out the more raised areas and avoid the recesses. So mostly we're going to be layering with this colour really. So what you need to do is just make sure it's nicely thinned and translucent translucent for the purpose. So there we go, and just make sure there's not loads in the brush. And on the skulls, what we want to do is to start looking for those raised up areas. So for example, on this one just here, it's a matter of just looking for areas such as the forehead and not going quite into the corners where it meets that gold design. So just very gently there like that. Then following the eyes all the way around and around the nose, areas like that, and then just start dotting along the teeth. So it's just picking out those flatter, more raised up parts. When it comes to the teeth, though, in this case, what we'll want to do is to start painting downwards towards the tip of them, leaving it dark at the very base of it where it meets the gums just there. So we're looking at this sort of area just here in this downward motion. It's exactly the same on the claws too, just to get that nice highlight going down towards the sharpest part. Once that's done, we're then ready to move on to highlight a screaming skull. And on the skulls, that means just looking for the most defined features and gently picking them out. So that's going to be areas such as around the eyes just here, and also the nose and the teeth. But when it comes to the claws and the teeth on the wolf, what we're looking to do here is instead just focus the colour towards the tip of them where it's sharpest. So just very gently down to points such as here. And there we are, all that bone detail is complete, as are all the claws on the pelt and the teeth on it too. And so now we're going to move on to the next feature, which is actually a major one on this miniature, and that is Horus's face. Because it's such a big character here, what we're going to do is push this further, and for it what we need to do is start out with a nice warm brown to get things going. So the colour I'm going to use here is Scrag Brown, and to apply it I've got my size 1 Artisoap's brush, and with this all we're looking to do is to base coat all of the face at this stage, so all the flesh that we can see. So make sure it's nicely thinned down, but remember we are applying this over a black undercoat, so you will need to do 2 or 3 thin coats just to build up the colour, but it's important it's smooth before you move on. So with that prepared, it's just a matter then of blocking the skin in, and we're looking at just here. Take your time as you're doing this because of the hood around the top of the head just there, so just really be as neat as you can as you're painting all of the flesh. With that base coat done, what we're now going to do is start a process of adding in lighter colours, working our way up through them to create highlights and that definition on the skin. And to do this, what we're going to be doing is sort of an in-between stage here, because we're moving towards using Cadian flesh tone, but it's too much of a jump in one go. So what we're going to do is mix it with Scrag Brown and then do that as an in-between stage. So that's what we need to do now. See, I've got both the paints ready, and I've got a size 0 brush now from Artisoapus, and I've still got the Scrag Brown from the previous stage. What I'm now going to do is just get some Cadian flesh tone and put it onto the palette next to it. So I'm just going to build up a fair amount of it just there like that. And then what we're looking for is a colour that's sort of in between the two. So what we need to do is just bring them together in the middle, and this way, by mixing them in between the two major parts of the paint, you can see the sort of tone we're creating, and so you can adjust it as you need to. We're looking for something like this. It doesn't have to be exact, but just something loosely like that is absolutely fine. And then we just need to make sure it's nicely thinned down so we've got that translucency, and make sure it's under control as well. So with this, the idea is to start applying it onto the skin on the more raised up parts whilst avoiding recessed details. So we're looking at avoiding things like wrinkles next to the nose, that sort of thing. So once you've got that fine point in your brush prepared, you just got to start looking to, well, avoid that sort of thing as we apply it to the flesh. So for example, if we go around the face here, we're looking at just following the nose down there and down the side of it. But when we get into the deepest part just there where it arcs in, it's going to skip past it and carry on again just past it. So just underneath here, underneath the eye on the cheek. And then we're just going to bring it down to the mouth. Now again, I'm just going to leave that little recess darker where we actually go to the lips here. So we've got the upper lip just on there. And then we've got the lower one as well, and then skip past the recess again to the chin. So you see now it's getting a little bit lighter, and we're starting to get some definition showing, and it's just a matter of just taking your time and just steadily building it up. Now you can see this first coat I'm applying is a bit translucent, which is ideal because what we want to do is gradually build it up, especially if I look at the forehead just here. See, thinly applying it, if it's put on correctly and it's nice and thin, it will dry relatively quickly. So I just need to pause and just let that settle, and then we're ready to go in for a second coat. And now when you put that second coat on, it's going to be stronger, so you can direct it to where you want it to be lighter, such as across the top of the head, and this way we're starting to get a nice gradient building up. Now that's done, we're ready to push it a little bit further by just moving on to Cadian flesh tone on its own this time. And I'm still going to use that size 0 brush for this, but now what we want to be is just a little bit more selective as to where exactly we're going to be picking the features out, because now we want to start to bring out the expression a bit more. So again, you don't need very much of it, but just make sure it's thinned down, because it's good to have to go into this needing to apply a few thin coats of it, because we just want to build that colour up, you see. If it's translucent, then it's ideal. You just need to make sure it's not so runny that it's going to go out of control. So remember, just use your palette to remove excess paint, so it's not too much on there. so you just got about that much. And then it's just a matter of looking for those more raised up areas once again. And now I'm going to be really steady as I'm moving in here because I'm looking for things such as the brow. So I just want to very gently start running across there, picking that out slowly. And you can see the colour's not making a massive stark difference immediately, but that's good because what I'm going to be doing is just letting that first coat dry and then building it up. So if we just go across the brow just there, then skip past onto the forehead and smoothly start applying it across the forehead just there onto the top. And again, you can see that translucency there, which is ideal because if we just let that dry for a moment and then go in for the second coat, if we just push a little bit further up, we now get that gradient even more as we get a little bit lighter towards the head, because you see I've not gone quite so far down to the brow this time. I'm going to skip past more when I go to the actual brow itself. But you can see doing that is exaggerating the feature of the face just there. So really now it's a matter of just doing this all across it. And now we are looking for the features on it that give them that stern expression, which includes these lines that are sort of going down the side of the mouth just here. So just make sure you pick those out as you're going around this area too. With that step done, you can see now the detail standing out a bit more, but still we need to push it further. So now we're going to go on to a lighter colour. We've got some Kislev flesh, but again, what we want to do is mix it with Cadian flesh tone as a sort of in-between stage to build up towards the highlight smoothly. So we need to set it up once again, and so I'm going to get some Kislev flesh, and I've already got the Cadian flesh tone from the previous stage. I have switched to a smaller brush, however, because I want a little bit more control now as we move into these finer details. And you can see on the palette what I'm doing is building it up as a gradual line of the colour that we're going to be using here. So at any point, should I need to go back to a previous stage, it's very easy to do so because you can see the different points of colour that we've got across here. So what we're looking for is that in-between sort of tone. So once again, something like this, something around this sort of area here. And then it's just a matter of, again, making sure it's nicely thinned down. And we're looking for those more raised up parts once again, and now just focusing more towards them, leaving more areas in shadow. So what we're looking to do is, again, starting around the centre of the face, we want to pick out the centre of the nose once more. So we're looking at doing this sort of area just here and the brows too. And now, as we get onto the forehead, what I'm going to start doing is making sure the paint's thin, so it's got that translucency, but I'm also going to start painting it as lines on top here to be sort of like wrinkles on the top of his brow. So just very gently there, and then just more opening up and covering a bit more as we get around the top of the head. Again, applying it as two coats, so that the first one dries so that the second one can be a little bit stronger and more directed towards the very top. But again, we're looking for those features that stand out, so it's going to be around the eyes, the cheekbone, those lines going down the side of the mouth, anything like that just gives a little bit more definition to the face. With that stage done, you can see now it's really starting to develop, and so we're ready to push it even further. Now just going on to Kislev flesh on its own. Still using that size 00 brush here because now we're doing even finer detail, and we're again looking to accentuate the features that stand out the most now because we've already painted the majority of it. Really what we're looking for is sharper things. So for example, we're looking at areas such as on the nose once again, and now as we're doing this, what I'm going to do is just focus it a bit more towards the tip of it. So we're looking at just that sort of area just there, and a little bit flaring out at the bottom too. When it comes to the brows, rather than doing everything again, now what we're looking to do is to go towards this little point just there, a little dot in the centre where it's just furrowed just there, and also a little bit on that side there too. So you can see now, rather than just doing everything, it's just looking for these parts that stand out and just carefully accentuating them just to help the expression pop a little bit more. That expression is really starting to stand out now, but still we just want to push it a little bit further. So now we're going to go even lighter, but again in that two-stage process of first of all a mix starting where we are and then moving towards that higher colour just on its own. So that lighter colour now is going to be Flayed One flesh, but of course we're still going to be using a little bit of Kislev flesh at the same time for the mix. And we're going to be starting out with that mix. So again, we need to get it ready first of all. Now I'm just going to get a little bit more Kislev flesh ready on the palette just there. And now what we need to do is bring that Flayed One flesh into it. So once again, I'm just going to put it to the side. So starting around about there, and then we just want to bring it into the mix. So again, we've got that gradual, well, gradient really going all the way across from light to dark. So what we're looking for is this mix then, and put the two together like that. We just need a small amount now, and with this, we're going for quite selective parts really. Just really want those parts to pop out, the most important bits of the expression really, and the facial structure. So it's only small amounts, but again, we're looking at areas such as the tip of the nose, so just along there. Again, just a small amount now on the brow, so we're looking at this sort of area just here, a little bit on the top of the ear, from the cheekbone, the chin, everything like that, just to emphasize those parts just that little bit more. And finally, we just need a small amount of Flayed One flesh on its own. And this is just for the most extreme parts that we want to highlight. So for example, the very tip of the nose now, there's just this little point just here on top of the brow. All these small features are just a little bit of this colour just to give them that final pop. And with that, the skin is now highlighted, but it is a bit monotone at this point because skin, of course, has all sorts of different colours mixed in there very subtly. So we're going to introduce a bit of that now. And the first thing to do here is to get some pink horror. I'm going to be using this for that lower lip. Now, to do this, what we need to do is mix it into the previous colours that we've got here. So we've got the variety of tones. We're looking at this sort of one here in the middle. So we're looking at the Acadian flesh tone area for this sort of thing. We just need a little bit of the pink. And what we want to do is create a colour in between the two. So just bring some of this up into that colour there. And what we're looking for is something kind of like that, you see, so a little bit pinker than the main colour that we've got. Now with that prepared then, you just need to get a small amount of this thin down, and what we're looking to do is to bring this onto that lower lip only, so just a small amount there we go, and then we just want to very gently move in and just start dotting it onto that lower lip just for a little bit of texture on there, so just along here. And there we are. It's a very subtle feature, but it is important to do, and we're now ready to do it once again, but this time using a purple. So the colour I've got here is Phoenician purple, and again what I'm going to do is start introducing it into some of the colours we've got already. Now in this case I'm looking to do this on the lower parts of the cheeks that are in shadow, and also the lower eyelids, and the kind of colour that we've got for those at this point is around about this sort of area here. So I'm just going to mix this purple into. I've got to be careful not to overdo it, so what we can see already, that colour's quite weak on there, so actually I'm going to take it a bit further into the brown. And what we're looking for is a colour of this sort of tone here, you see. So it's only subtly purple, it's not over the top, it's just a small amount mixed in there and a little bit darker. But it's ideal for what we need because once it's thinned down, we can then start introducing it into the darker areas. And because we've got quite a cold colour here, it'll be a really nice contrast to the warmer colours that we've got for the highlights. So what we're looking at doing is, first of all, very carefully moving in to pick out that lower eyelid. So that's going to be just in here. So we're looking at this area right there. But also what we want to do is introduce this into this darker part that we've got beneath the cheekbone. So we're looking at this area just in here. I finished with a more purple tone, so now the next thing I'm going to do is actually add the hint of some shaved hair on top of his head, because whilst Horus is bald, in some of the early books it talks about him having a shaved scalp, so I want to give the impression of that here. And so what I've got is some Mechanicus Standard Grey, which once again we're going to introduce in some of the previous mixes that we've got. In this case, what I'm looking at is going for around about this point here with the colours above it, and what we want to do is, again, bring them together, and we want to go quite far into it. We're looking at getting this sort of tone here. Now, when applying this, I want to make sure it's really, really thin because I want the flesh to be showing through. So to do that, we're going to be glazing this on. So it's just a matter of making sure you really thin it down with quite a bit of water. Then on the more open part of the palette, I'm just going to test it to see what sort of impression we're getting. And you can see that's the sort of colour. You can also see just how thin it is, so I'm happy with that. And with this, what we then need to do is just glaze it over the area where the hair would be, so following the line of it. So that means we're looking at applying it towards the very top, so around about here, and then want to bring it down the sides of the head to where the sideburns would be. So we just want to go down to that sort of point just there. Now, depending on how strong you want this to be, you will need to apply a few coats of it, but I'm just going to go for 2 because I don't want to overdo it. I just want to give that subtle impression of the shaved hair. Once you're happy with that effect, the next thing to do is to paint in his eyes, and here what we need is a black and then a white. So first of all, I'm going to be using some Doom Death black here, and then I'm going to use some matte white from the Army Painter. But we need to start out with the black, and painting the eyes is of course tricky. So if you're not sure about doing this, you could just do the black and leave it there. The choice really is yours. But for the black, what we need to do first of all is just make sure it's nice and thin and relatively inky. So just make sure you test on your palette, just seeing how it's behaving. It's flowing really nicely from the brush there, so I'm happy with that. And then that fine tip on the bristles is really important. So just gently bring them together, and then what I do for this sort of thing is just brace my hand so I'm really steady, move in along the eye line like this, and then just very carefully just paint that little black line in between the eyelids. So we're looking at just here. Once that's done, you're then ready for matte white, and here we're just looking to do a dot on either side of the pupil. So you just need to move in very carefully with your finest brush and just gently introduce a little dot on either side. Now it's very easy to go wrong doing this and make the eyes not look in the same direction, so if you do need to adjust, just go back to the black paint just to make any adjustments you need to, but really it's just a matter of being patient and being as steady as possible. And with those eyes painted in, you can see we get loads more character on the miniature, and now Horus is looking intuitively imposing. And soon we're going to be painting all those eyes of Horus that appear on his armour, but before we do so, there's a little detail we need to pick out, and that is on the old lunar wolf symbols that appear on his armour, and there are 2 of them. Now we painted the wolf heads in these gold, and we've also got that background black, but there are moons on here, and we need to paint these with a near white. So for this, what we need is some pallid witch flesh, followed by a highlight of matte white. So first of all, we need some pallid witch flesh. I'm sticking to my size 00 brush for this because these details are pretty small, but they do need to be picked out. So you want that control here for it. Let's make sure as ever it's nicely thinned down, and this being a layer paint, you will have to do 2 or 3 coats of it, but it's just a matter of being patient again and making sure they're nice and smooth, because what we're looking at is the moon that appears on this symbol. So in the case of this one up here on the shoulder, you can see it's this side of it. So what we're looking at is painting this area just here, and it goes up the side of the wolf's head. The other one is on the knee down here, and in this case, it's once again just on the side. With the base coat done, we're then ready to move on to a highlight with a pure white. So here I'm using matte white. We don't need to worry about the one down the knee here, but the one on the shoulder, there is an edge to it. So we want to make sure we go around there. We're looking at this part just along here. With that small detail now done, we're ready to move on to a much bigger detail, because now it's time to paint all those eyes that appear on Horus's armour. And the first stage of doing this is to make sure they're all base coated black. So here I'm returning to Doom Death Black, though again, go for whatever black you want to use here. As long as it's a pitch black, it's fine. And with this, I've got a size 1 brush, because for this first step, all I'm looking to do is just to base coat all of them to make sure they're a solid black to build up the red effect on it. So once your paint's ready, it's just a matter of looking for each one, and there are quite a few. So just take your time looking around to make sure you get them all, and just make sure you block them in entirely. And this includes the pupil in the middle, so all of it around here. Now in addition, there's a little bit else to do with the black at this stage, and that includes painting this little targeting lens just up here. So we want to paint the glass of it, and also the tiny one just above it. And also we've got the eyes of the wolf to pick out as well. There we go, with the black applied, we've got a nice neat starting point for all these eyes, and also on the wolf, you just notice I've also painted its nose black as well. And with that done, we're now ready to start the effect, and to do this we need to start with a very dark red, so I'm going to mix one here. Once again I've got Doom Death Black, but I'm going to introduce some corn red to it, and so what we need to do is set it up on the palette first of all. I've also gone down to my size 00 brush here, because we want to have more control as we apply it, because we need to be accurate as we do this. We're just looking to paint around the pupils that appear in the eyes just here, so we need that control for it. And the sort of shade we're going for is, as I say, a very dark red. We're looking for something like that, something in that region. And with that mixed up then, you just need to make sure it's thinned down as ever, and then we're ready to start blocking it in. And what we're aiming to do is to paint it onto the eye so that we get a little bit of black on the surrounding area where it meets that metal on the outside. So on this one, for example, we're looking to paint the main part of it here, just leaving it black around the outer extreme, and then going right up to the pupil, so just touching it in the center. So just there like that. Same there on the other side. Now there's one eye where it's a bit tricky doing this because the pupil isn't actually sculpted on it, and that is this one down here, right in the middle of his belt. So for this one, you'll probably need to re-establish the black towards the end of it, but once again, just a matter of painting it red at this moment to make sure it's got that glassy appearance. Also, be aware that one of the eyes doesn't have a black pupil. It's actually a gold one. That's this one just here on the knee, but the red of it is painted in the exact same way as what we're doing with all the other eyes. With that first dark red done, we're now ready to make it a little bit lighter. So now it's just going to be corn red on its own. And what we're going to do with this colour is just focus it a little bit more towards the middle of each of these eyes. So once again, I don't need loads of it, but definitely stick to your small brush. So I'm still using my size 00 for this. And what we're looking to do is to just build up our colour really as we get closer towards the middle of the eye. So to do this, you need to make sure we have that translucency in the paint. So just thin it down as you need to until it's fairly inky, sort of this point here. And then the idea here is to start to get closer towards that central pupil. So in the case of this eye just here, what we're looking to do is to apply it, again going right up to that central part, so just letting it settle in the recess right next to it, and then bringing it out to about that point there, you see? So it's a slightly darker red the further out that you go. And the same is true on each of these eyes. And there we are with that red done. We're now ready to push it even further. So now what we're going to do is move on to quite a bright red. So we've got some Evilson Scarlet next. And after this, we'll need some Fire Dragon Bright, followed by some Uriel Yellow. And then finally, we need some Matte White. And this is just going to be for that specular highlight. So kind of a shine on some glass. But first of all, we need that Evilson Scarlet. And to apply it, again, stick to your small brush. So still using the size 00. With this, we're just looking to close that colour in a bit further towards the pupil of each of these eyes. So once again, it's a matter of thinning it down and making sure it's got that translucency about it. So we're looking for that slight inkiness in the paint, so about this point just here. And that, with that prepared, then what we're looking to do is to apply it around those pupils. So for example, once again, the central eye, what we want to do is just make sure it touches the actual pupil itself, so run it into that recess around it, and then just take it a short distance away from it, so to around about there. We're now ready to add some Fire Dragon Bright, and this is going to be very much the same sort of procedure, just tightened now even more towards the pupils. So again, we're just looking to paint it into that recess surrounding it, so just dropping it into that area there, and then just a very short distance now outside of either side of the pupil. Once you're happy with that orange, we're then ready to move on to a yellow. So here I've got some Uriel yellow, and this time it's just going to be a line around the pupil itself. So very carefully applied right into this point of contact, the two areas just along here. And then finally, we just need some matte white, and this is to give the impression of a glassy sort of shine on these details. And for this, all we've got to do is just put a little dot of this white just in the top right of each eye, like that. Just to give that little specular reflection on the glass. And with that, those eyes are now complete. And so in fact is this part of the assembly of Horus the Warmaster, because now we've painted all the features that appear on here. But of course the model isn't quite finished yet, because we do have to do that scenic base. So that's what we're going to be moving on to now. Now ready to start painting that scenic base, and remember this was undercoated using Xandri dust spray, and what I've done is just put it together at this stage so you can see the full assembly of it here. But remember, I've used magnets to help secure everything in place, so for example it does still come apart, but throughout painting this what I'm mostly going to be doing is painting it as a single piece like this, and then at each stage I'll disassemble it just to be able to access all the nooks and crannies to make sure I've got everything before putting it back together for the next step. And the first thing that we're going to do is start to build up the marble that appears for the majority of this base, so it's all the parts on top of it, like that eagle head, the staircase, everything like that. For this we're going to be starting out with some Rakarth flesh, and then we're going to move on to some Wraithbone, and both these colours are going to be dry brushed on, and I'm actually using a bit of an unusual dry brush here. What I've got is some of these rounded tip ones. Now these are from Artist Opus, these are their Series D ones, and you can see they're nice soft bristles, so ideal for the sort of effect of what I'm looking to build up here. But you can also get brushes like this from the Army Painter too. There's a few companies that make them. They're ideal for the sort of effect that we want to get for this though. Now to use them, I've got two. I've got a large one and a medium one. The medium one's because there are going to be some parts of this base that I can't quite access with the big one, but for the most part I'm going to be using the big one. And to set this up, it's a bit like an all dry brush. Just get a little bit of that paint on the bristles, and then on your tissue all you got to do is work it into them. So it's just a matter of this rounded motion to really work it in there, then remove the excess too. So just work your way along to get rid of most of that paint, so there's not much left. You'll see the sort of appearance of what we're getting there appearing on the tissue itself. And once you're getting that sort of effect, what we then need to do is start applying it to the base, and we're targeting all the marbles, so the eagle head, the stairs, a few bits scattered around. And for all of it, what we're looking for is a buffing motion. So this sort of round motion like this, just gradually drawing it across all of this marble, just to get that smooth colour building up. Once that's done, we're then ready to move on to Wraithbone, and this is going to be softly dry brushed on once again, and you can see I'm using the medium dry brush straight from the start here. And what I'm looking to do here is add a little bit of variation to things as well as a highlight. So you can see I'm still doing that same rounded motion, and it's getting a bit of a highlight on there, but on some parts I'm just pressing a bit heavier to make the colour a bit lighter. So for example, on the beak just here. With that done, you can see we've got a nice marble-like colour happening on there now, and so we can move on to the next step, which is going to be to pick out a few of the details that appear around it. I'm going to do this quite roughly, which is why we're doing it now. What we need first of all is some Mechanica Standard Grey for various bits of rubble, and then for the metallics we'll need a little bit of Retributor Armour, followed by some Lead Belcher. But first of all, what we need is that Mechanica Standard Grey, and to apply it, what I've got is a regiment brush from the Army Painter, just to start out with, but you'll definitely want to have a larger brush because some of these areas can be quite big. Just change as you need to, depending on what you're comfortable with. But as ever, it's just a matter of making sure that paint's ready on your palette, and then what we're looking for are the rough bits of rock that are somewhat underneath the rubble and in some cases on top of it. So for example, there's some small areas such as the bits that you can see on the staircase just here. I just want to start just lightly dotting these parts just to give them that greyish tone like that. So just carefully applying it over the top of the more pale colour we've got for the staircase. Some much larger areas of this for which you might want to go for that larger brush, and they all tend to be down the bottom here. You can see underneath the staircase, for example, all the way around here. A good thing to do for this sort of thing is just to make sure the paint's thinned down a little bit more than normal, just to help it soak into this detail so you can get all of that. Now bear in mind some of this is going to be hidden away amongst all the various assemblies, so you will probably have to take some of it apart. So for example, underneath that rock just there, you can see there's all this to do here, so just make sure you take your time to get all of it. Once you're finished with the grey, you're then ready to move on to some gold. So here I'm using Retributor Armour, and this is first of all for this little decorative band that we've got going up the staircase. So it goes up here on the banister all the way up to the top, and the same is true on the other side. Now you can see here it requires a little bit of control, so I switch to a size 1 brush here from Artistopus, just to be able to go along there like that. Now in addition, there's an optional piece of gold here because on the base there are some bits of dead space marines. So for example, you've got here a shoulder plate. Now depending on what legion you want to paint here, you might want to do this band in gold. The choice really is yours. And then finally we're ready to move on to some lead belcher, and this is for all these metal girders that are just cast around in all of this rubble. Once you're happy with those metallics, we're then ready to do a few more base coats before we move on to adding a wash onto this base. And we're going to be starting out with some Corvus Black, for which there are a few things to do. But then after that, what we'll need is Mechanica Standard Grey to add a bit of detail onto the marble. Then finally, we're going to go to Xandri Dust, and this is just to re-establish all the skulls that are on the base. But first of all, we need some Corvus Black, and there are 2 phases to applying this, starting out with just being quite neat as usual, really. So for this, I've got my size 1 brush here from Artistopus, and what I'm looking to do is to thin it down so it's good for base coating, because I'm going to be painting the shoulder pads of the Dead Space Marines on the base with this colour. So it could be a potential different number of legions here. It could be Iron Hands, Dark Angels or Raven Guard. But if you've got a friend who plays Horus Heresy, then what I recommend you do is paint these in the colour of their legion of choice. But once you've done those, the next thing to do with Corvus Black is going to be to darken down some of the underside of this base. So it's going to be a little bit like soot damage, that sort of thing. And for this, we're going to be applying it a little bit unusually. What I've got here is a smaller dry brush from Citadel. And what I'm going to do is water this down quite a bit on the palette to make it quite inky. So I want a bit more than that. So just get some more paint in there and then a touch more water. And we're looking for something kind of like this, and the idea here is to start stippling it on the underside of the scenic base. So for example, around about this sort of area just here, what I'm going to do is just start dotting it in so it runs into that texture. It's going to roughly move it around and apply a good amount, kind of like that. Then once you've done roughly about that much, just quickly make sure you wash your brush so it's damp, and just use that just to sponge it and smear it around a little bit more, just to spread that dark colour into all of this texture. Once the Corvus Black is completely dry and you've got that darker colour underneath, the next thing we're going to do is add the impression of some veins running through the marble on here. And for this, what I've got is Mechanica Standard Grey, which I thinned down a fair bit so it's quite inky. And what we're looking to do is just to very lightly and loosely just apply some hints of lines just running across the surface of it. So just very gently like that. You see, I'm almost dotting it on, just keeping it quite natural as I go. And occasionally you want to split it and start bringing it up into different ones running away from each other. But when you get to the end of segments, such as just here, bear in mind this is a different piece of marble from that one. So you don't want the line to continue smoothly. Instead, as you get to the next one, you want to start a new one and just start going in its own direction so you get that nice natural impression. And finally, we just need a small amount of Xandri Dust, and this is just to neaten up all the skulls that are hidden amongst the rubble. And with all those colours now applied, we can move on to putting a wash on top of all this scenery. And for this, what we need is 2 colours. We need a brown wash and also a black wash. So I'm going to be using some Agrax Earthshade and some Nuln Oil at the same time. I'm going to let them mix as we go along. But when it comes to the Agrax Earthshade, there's actually 2 different ways we need to put it on. Now, when it comes to doing this, what I recommend you do is wash all the parts separately, because if you have them together whilst they're still wet and they dry that way, it can really stick them all together and you won't be able to get it apart again. So definitely keep each part separate as you do this. And to focus on, I'm going to start on the eagle head, but you do the same thing on the stairs and the other piece. Now, first of all, just want to set both these washers up. So I'm just going to start out by getting some Nuln Oil on the palette. And for this, I'm using my monster brush here from the Army Painter. I'm going to be quite generous with the amount I get onto the palette just there. And then I just want to get some Agrax Earthshade as well. So just get a few brushfuls. So 1, 2, and 3. And I'll start out with the Agrax Earthshade, and having them both on the palette means I can jump back and forth between them as I need to without washing the brush. So this way we can be nice and quick as we do it and the paint's not going to dry out. So we're going to start with pure Agrax Earthshade on the parts that are going to be like rubble. So for example, around here, what we want to do is really run it into all the nooks and crannies to really darken all that rubble down. But if we take this directly onto the marble, it's a little bit too strong, you see. If I paint it straight on there, you can see it's a bit too dark and it takes away that lighter colour we've got. So what I'm going to do is just get some brushfuls of water directly on the miniature, just start using that to dilute it and spreading that around. So this way it's weaker shading as we're doing areas such as the marble, same on the stairs and things. Now we've got the black wash for doing the underside where we want it to be darker. So as you get around to this sort of area here, just grab that Nuln Oil and apply it directly onto the underside. The wash is now completely dry, and you can see it's given us that really nice war-torn appearance of it. So the marble's really been through hell as the temple it's made of is collapsing and landing on all the rubble beneath. And with that all done, we're now ready to move on to doing some highlighting here. And for this, dry brushing is the perfect technique to use because it's so textured. And I'm going to start out with some Administratum Grey here for the darker parts and all the rubble, and then I'm going to go back to Wraithbone. This is for that marble, but also a little bit of dust on some areas. So first of all, what we need is that Administratum Grey, and to apply it, I've got my small dry brush here. And when you're doing this, you may find that you might want to use that regiment brush, remember like we did earlier on the pelt on the back of Horus, for a bit more directional control when you're doing the parts of the rubble that are on top of the stairs. But for the parts underneath, a brush like this is ideal because what we can do is look for all this texture around here, just lightly start going back and forth across it very gently just to get a bit of a highlight on all that texture. Once you've finished with that, we can then move on to doing some Wraithbone, which is once again going to be dry brushed on, but you can see I've moved to a medium dry brush from Citadel now, so a much larger one, because this is just going to be very lightly over all the marble for the most part, so very gently, just to really help it pop out once again, but not so heavily that we start going over too much all the detail we put in. So for example, the veins, you don't want to go and obscure them, so just very lightly dust it across it. But in addition, this is a good colour for the dust that appears on the rubble too, so as you're going across it, be sure to just bring it down onto those greyer parts and just very lightly now go over those to help finish them off too. And with that done, we've now got a really nice ruined temple marble, and if you wanted to, you could just leave the base here. However, we think this looks really evocative, almost like it's sort of standing out over a ruined city. So what we want to do is add a bit of a fiery glow as if the city's burning underneath it and just reflecting on some of it. And we're looking for that overhanging eagle head for where we're going to do this. Now, if you want to do this, what you need to do is start out with a dark red. So here we've got some corn red, and what we're going to do is stipple it on very much like what we did with Corvus Black earlier on. Just a little bit stronger this time. And for it, I've got a new small dry brush here from Citadel, and the reason is because the bristles are holding together nicely, so it's almost like a chisel tip, so I've got control as to where it's going. Now we just need to thin it down a little bit, so it's a little bit more runny than it is straight out the pot, so just bring it down like that. Then I'm just going to remove the excess, so it's almost like setting up for a wet brush really. You can see the sort of consistency there of the paint in the bristles. And with this, what I'm now going to do is start stippling directly upwards from this point here. So bear in mind some of this rock is overhanging. What we need to do is be getting the red on the underside of it, sort of building it up steadily like that. But where it overhangs, it will then just go straight past it. So this girder, for example, will only catch the red at this sort of point here. It won't go any further down. That's also true as well. As we go further up and get underneath the eagle, just bear in mind where the overhang is. If it's blocking the light, the red's not going to get to it. So just bear that in mind as you apply it underneath. I've finished building up that red, and you can see it's just a matter of taking your time and always making sure that it's going straight up, so you're getting those overhangs that stay darker. And well, with that done, what we're now going to do is make it brighter, and so we need to go through a sequence of colours getting more towards yellow. So what we need first of all is some Evilson Scarlet. After this, we're going to add some Fire Dragon Bright, and then finally we need some Uriel Yellow. But we're going to start out with Evilson Scarlet, and the application of this is going to be very, very similar to what we've just done. So I'm still using that newest small dry brush from Citadel. Make sure it's clean for this, but again, what we're looking to do is to get this ready and just thin it ever so slightly as if we were going to be doing a wet brush with it. So just thinning it down so it's a bit more inky than it is straight out the pot. But then it's a matter of just removing the excess off on some tissue, so there's not much there. And then with this, we're now just going to again start stippling it upwards towards the top of the base. So we want to go from this direction, remember, straight this way. Only the difference here this time is that we're just not going to go quite so far. So we're looking to make the red more intense the further down we get towards here. So this time when you get to this point where the overhang of the eagle is, we're just going to hint at it just in the middle, just around about there, but then really focus it more and more down towards the bottom. Once that's done, we're then ready to move on to an orange. So here I'm using some Fire Dragon Bright, and once again we're looking for that same sort of motion, just stippling it upwards directly from underneath just to get this hotter appearance further down. So now we're not going all the way. Instead, at most, I'm just going to be grazing that bit just there, but instead I'm focusing it more and more towards the base down here. And then finally, we can complete the effect with some Uriel Yellow, once again stippled on with the same motion, just a bit further down now to be the hottest part of the fire. So we're looking at this sort of area just around here. And well, once you've done this, Horus is complete. All you got to do is just paint the base rims, and this can be any colour you like, but in this case, I'm going to be going for Doom Death Black, and then you just need to glue Horus into the scenic base. Now remember, when you do this, use super glue, but once you've done so, Horus is complete. here we have the completed Horus Lupercal, Horus the Warmaster, the favoured son, ready to go forth and cast down the false emperor. So as you've seen, when it comes to painting Horus at first glance, he is very intimidating, not least because this model's very finely detailed, and of course it's very expensive too. But as you've seen, by approaching it in simple steps and breaking it down, it's actually just as straightforward as painting any other miniature. Remember, start out with painting that armour, because if you do all of that black and gold, whilst it takes a bit of time, you will at the end of that suddenly realise you've actually painted the majority of the miniature, and from that point on it's just a matter of painting small details. Now when it comes to those small details, the key ones are of course his face, because it's a focal point of any miniature, but also the eyes of Horus that appear around his armour. Definitely take your time when you're doing these features, and this way you'll have an absolutely fantastic looking miniature at the end. So have fun painting Horus, and see you again very soon.